Hey, how's it going, everyone? So this video is going to be really awesome because I'm going to be walking you through the entire introduction into something called Xamarin Forms. So Xamarin Forms is a product that's created by Windows, and it's actually used to create cross-platform mobile apps. Basically, what that means is that we're going to write code to build a mobile app, and it'll be able to run on both iOS and Android. And we're going to do all of this using something called Xamarin Forms. So Xamarin Forms is a really popular framework. There's a lot of developers, a lot of companies that are using it. And so my goal in this video is just to kind of bring you guys some content on that. I'm going to walk you through all of the basic concepts, and we'll actually end up building this little to-do app, which should give me a chance to kind of walk through all the main parts of Xamarin Forms. But with that out of the way, let's get into these Xamarin Forms. So you're not going to need any experience building mobile apps in order to get into this, although you will need a little bit of knowledge with just computer programming in general. More specifically, we're going to be using the C# programming language. Now, this is one of the most popular programming languages in the world. And if you've never used it, I actually do have a full introductory course on C# over on my channel, and I can put a link to that in the description. So if you want to kind of brush up on that a bit, I do have some content available there. But I'm just going to kind of assume that you have a basic understanding of C# and a basic understanding of some of these core programming topics as we go through here. Now, this isn't going to be extremely C# heavy. You'll see that a lot of this, we're just kind of building out user interfaces and writing little pieces of code here and there. So I think if you're more at a beginner level, you'll definitely be able to follow along with this. But just if you want some more information on C#, that is available as well. Otherwise, though, there's really no prerequisites. You can do this on a Windows, you can do this on a Mac. I will show you how to get set up on both, and then we'll just kind of be able to follow along throughout the video. So as far as the order that we're going to cover things in today, obviously this is just a little intro, and then I'm going to show you how to install and set everything up on your computer. So you're going to need two things. We're going to need this program called Visual Studio, and then we're also going to need you to get you set up with a device emulator. So we're going to be doing all of our development on an Android device emulator, and I'll show you how to get that set up. But otherwise, though, you should just be able to follow along straight with me as I go through and code all this stuff. I'm going to teach you the core concepts of Xamarin Forms. We'll also talk about a really powerful design pattern that's used in Xamarin Forms. And then we'll end up, like I said, building this little to-do list app, which should be pretty fun. So this will just be a full introduction. You'll learn all the core concepts. Without further ado, let's go ahead and we'll get you set up on Windows or Mac, and then we'll just get straight into learning Xamarin Forms. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do in order to get started here on a Mac is we need to download and install Visual Studio. So Visual Studio is a text editor, which it's sort of like an all-encompassing integrated development environment. An IDE is what we call it. And this will allow us to build these apps really easily. So it'll have device emulators, it'll have all sorts of build and debug tools, just a really good environment to do all this stuff in. So you want to head over to visualstudio.microsoft.com. If you just Google Visual Studio, this will pop up. And then down here, we want Visual Studio for Mac. So you're just going to click on that. And then that should download. You're going to get a DMG file. So you can just open that up. And then what this will do is it'll open up an installer, which we can use to run through. So Visual Studio, it's a big application. Like I was saying, there's a lot of things, and we can choose what types of things we want to download. So really what we want to do is step through and we just want to download all the stuff for Xamarin Forms for building mobile apps, okay? Now, it might take a little while for this stuff to download. There's probably around 4 or 5 gigs worth of stuff that we need to download just because it is such a beast of a program. But yeah, it probably shouldn't take more than 10 or 15 minutes depending on your internet speed. Okay, so let's open this and we'll step through it. Okay, let's continue. And okay, so here now we can select all the different things that we want. So it's probably a good idea if you just want to select all of these, but really what we need is the Android and the iOS. So all of this Xamarin stuff there, and then also .NET Core as well. Now I already have all this installed, but you'll go ahead and install all of this. And then once you're done, it's going to open up Visual Studio. So this window right here should pop up. So this is our Visual Studio window. Like I said, it shouldn't take more than 10 or 15 minutes. And what we want to do is create a new project. So I'll just click New here. And then down here, we want to go to this multi-platform section. We're going to go to App, and then you're going to click Blank Forms App. Now you want to make sure that you have C# selected. C# is the language that we're going to be writing all of this in. And then you're just going to click Next. And now the app name. So we're going to call this to-do list app, because that's what we're going to be building. We're going to be building this little to-do list. So you're going to hit next. And if you want to change like where it's located, that's fine. By default, it's just in the users folder. And then if you want Git for version control, if you know how Git works, I'm not going to be explaining that in this video, but if you want to use it, you can check that. And then let's create it. So what this is going to do now is this will open up our little text editor here. And this is the environment that we're going to be working in. Now, in order for us to be able to run and test all of our code, we're going to need something called a device emulator. And a device emulator is a little program which sort of emulates an actual mobile device. Now, you can run this stuff on your physical mobile device if you want. I'm not going to be covering that in this video. But generally, when people are developing this stuff, they'll use a device emulator. It's definitely not the best as far as like memory usage. So like your computer might start, the fans might start going and stuff. It's going to be using a lot of memory, but that's just kind of the nature of mobile app development. So what you want to do is come up here to Tools, and then you're going to go to Android Device Manager. So we're going to be using an Android device. You can do this on an iPhone as well. I'm going to be doing everything on an Android just because Android comes with this stuff by default. Also, when you're on Windows, sometimes it's like a lot harder to emulate this stuff on iOS. So then you just want to click on New Device, and I'm going to be using a Pixel 2 with Pi 9.0. So Pixel 2 and then Pi, which is version 9 of the API. Basically, this is just like what version of Android are you going to be supporting with this? And this is fine. So then you're just going to create that, and then it might take like 10 minutes. I think it's about 1 gigabyte in size. And then you'll have your little emulator here. So what you want to do is you just want to hit play, and then this will load up the emulator. Now, if you've never used an emulator before, they're actually kind of fun. So you get, basically like a little version of a phone here, and you can kind of play around with it, which is cool. But what we're going to be doing is running our app on it. So this should automatically populate in here. Like it should pick up that this is a virtual device. And down here in this to-do list app, this is actually where our entire app is in. So this is where we're going to be working, in this to-do list app folder. So if you just click this play button, now there's going to be a bunch of like debugging stuff that comes up down here. This is essentially going to take the app, build it, bundle it, and then ship it over. So it'll actually end up being installed on this phone. And then we can like test it and interact with it and do all that kind of fun stuff. So yeah, it might take a couple seconds, especially if you just downloaded the emulator, but we'll deploy this to the device, and then kind of a default screen should pop up over there. And so really, this is going to be our workflow as we go through for the rest of the tutorial. And this is a good way of setting it up. So we'll have our device thing over here on the side, and then over here, we're going to be writing our code. Now, most of the coding we're going to be doing is going to be in this main page.xaml file. So this is, you can just kind of double click on this, and this is where we're going to be doing most of our coding. So this is kind of where all the content for this app is going to be. And just real quick, just to make sure that this is working, you can actually change the text in one of these and then save the file, and then it'll update over there. And we'll talk more about that in a second. But otherwise, that's how you can get set up on here. And then for the rest of the tutorial, we'll be kind of working in this environment. And then just a quick note about some of these files over here. So that you'll see that there's like 3 folders. So there's this iOS folder, there's this Android folder, and then there's just the to-do list app folder. This is where we're going to be doing 99% of the coding. We will look at like some places where we can use Android and iOS, but this is basically it. Okay, so you have this like app.xaml file and this main page.xaml. We'll talk more about XAML and what all that stuff is later. But now you're set up, you're ready to go, and we can move on with the tutorial. All right, so in this section, I want to show you how to get installed and set up with Visual Studio on Windows. So Visual Studio is the program that we're going to be developing these Xamarin Forms apps in. So in order to download it, you're just going to go to visualstudio.microsoft.com, and then down here, we're going to scroll down, and you'll see here that there's this section for Visual Studio. So download Visual Studio. You're going to go ahead and download the Community 2019 edition. This is a free edition. And this is like it'll have everything that we need in order to do all this Xamarin Forms stuff. So let's open this up. And now one thing I will say is Visual Studio is a beast of a program. So it might take 10 or 15 minutes for you to download and install everything. There's going to be like tons of stuff that needs to get installed and all that. So I'm going to go ahead and just run this installer. Now, when we get in here, we're going to need to explicitly tell Visual Studio that we want to get all this stuff for like mobile app development. So we'll wait until this is done, and then I'll go ahead and show you how to do that. So you'll see here that there's this little dialog that pops up, and what we want to do is we want to download everything for mobile development. So if you scroll down, you'll see here it says mobile development with .NET. Build cross-platform apps for iOS, Android, and Windows using Xamarin. Just click on that. So this is what we're going to need. And then down here, there should be a button to install that. So you want to install all of that stuff. Now, I already have it on my computer, so I don't need to go through that process. But once you've installed all this stuff with .NET, then Visual Studio is going to open. So let me open that up here. Okay, so we'll open up Visual Studio. Now, this is what's going to pop up when you're done installing everything. And what we're going to do is we're just going to create our first project. And I'm also going to get you guys set up with a emulator. Okay, so we're just going to say not now. Now I'm going to do, I guess, the dark theme. You can pick whichever one you want. And we'll start Visual Studio. Okay, so then this dialog will pop up and we're going to create a new project. So just come over here and click Create New Project. Okay, so we're just going to scroll down and we want to find the right type of app. Now we're going to be building a mobile app using Xamarin Forms. So you're just going to click on this right here. Now don't click on Android, or there's another one for iOS. Click on mobile app Xamarin.forms because this is going to target both platforms. So we're going to click next and we're going to call this to-do list app. And you can change like where you want that to be stored, and then we'll go ahead and create it. So then if it asks you for like a template, we're just going to do the blank template. So we'll kind of start from scratch with this whole thing. Okay, so now over here, we're in the Visual Studio like user interface. Now I'm gonna be filming this video on a Mac, but I did wanna show everyone who's using Windows how to install this. So when I'm filming the video, it's gonna look a little bit different from this, but it's basically all the same stuff. So let me show you kind of how to get all this set up. Now, the first thing that we need to do is we need to go up and we need to install an emulator. So an emulator is a program that allows us to basically emulate a real device on our computer. So you're gonna come up here to Tools and then go down to Android, and you're gonna go to Android Device Manager. So I'm gonna just hit yes on this. And this is gonna allow us to like configure and create an emulator. So you can see I already have one created, but what you wanna do is come over here to New, and you're gonna click Create New Device. Now I'm going to be using a Pixel 2 that's going to have this OS of Pi 9.0. So this is kind of just like the version of Android that it's going to run. And then we're going to just create that. Now I already have it created, so that's just over here. And then what you want to do is you just want to start it. Now you might get this little message about Hyper-V not being configured. If you just click on this documentation link, you can go ahead and set that up, but it's not like super necessary, although it will definitely make it a little bit faster. So we're gonna go ahead and run that emulator. And you can see that this kind of pops up here. So if you've never used an emulator before, they can be really fun to use. So this is just like an Android device that is sort of emulated over here. And I'm gonna be using Android. You can also, I'm pretty sure you can use iOS as well on Windows, but I'm just gonna be using this Android one. Okay, so once you have your emulator open, then all you want to do is come over here and you'll see that there's this little start button. So this is how you're actually going to run the code. So if you just click on this, what that'll do then is it'll start building all the code for your project, and then it'll actually put it over onto your emulated device. So then we can pull that back up. You can see it says like phone is starting, all that stuff, and then this will eventually like load up onto there. Okay, so here we are in Visual Studio, and I just have this main page.xaml opened up. And the first thing that I really want to do in this tutorial, now that we've set everything up, is just walk you through what this XAML, we call it XAML, what exactly this is and how it works. Now, if you've ever used HTML before, so HTML hypertext markup language, this is going to look really familiar to you. It's actually very similar. So this is what we call an XML syntaxed language. And XML is basically a syntax that we can use to lay out user interfaces, and it's used really, really often in the industry. And so XAML, which is XAML, this is what's used in these Xamarin Forms. So this is how we're going to lay out all of the user interfaces for the most part for our app. Now you can see here that we have just kind of this basic structure set up, and this was just given to us by default when we created the app. But there's really like sort of the main feature of this are these tags. So you can see here when I highlight over this, it highlights these two tags. Now in this like XML and this XAML syntax, everything is contained and everything is rendered out inside of these tags. So the tag just has like a less than sign, and then here, this is called stack layout. So this tag has a name, and then you have the greater than sign to kind of end it off. There's two main types of tags that we're going to be working with. There's container tags, and then there's self-closing tags. So the container tags are like this stack layout. You can see there's a starting tag, and then there's an ending tag. And then inside, we're going to put all of these other tags. There's also what we call self-closing tags. And these, and let me see if I can find one. For example, like these labels down here, they're self-closing. So you can see that there's not two tags, there's just one, and we end these off with that /. So with the containers, you just have it like this, and then to end it off, you put that /. With the self-closing ones, though, they just look like that. Now, we're going to be using different container tags. Most of the time are going to be used for formatting and for styling, and then we'll use things like labels. We'll also have like a checkbox and like a search field and all of that, which are going to be self-closing. So you'll get more comfortable with this syntax if you're not already comfortable with it as we go through the tutorial. Cool. So the first thing then that I want to do is just show you how we can update this XAML. So over here, if I was to, for example, go into this label, and this label is basically just like a piece of text. You can see we have one down here. We also have one up here. I could modify this. So for example, we have this, what we call a text attribute. If I changed what was here inside of these quotation marks to like hello world, all I have to do is save this, and it should automatically update over here on the app. So you can see there that it updated over there. So anytime that you change things here in this XAML file, it will automatically update whenever you save the file onto the app. Now let's take a look at this label tag real quick, because I want to point out what these things are right here. So we talked about how each one of these tags has a name. In this case, this tag is called label. This is the label tag. That's how we would refer to it. These tags also have attributes though, and these attributes are essentially like pieces of data that we can give to each one of these tags that lets it know how to do its job. So the label has one of these text attributes. You can see it says hello world here, and this is just going to be in a string. And then there's also some of these attributes that we can use to style these things. So it says like horizontal text alignment. You can see that center. I could change this over here if I wanted to. And actually, if you're using Visual Studio, it should give you options. So like you see here, I just have the equal sign, and then if I start typing in the quotation mark, it'll give me all these options. So we could put start here, and then we'll end that off. And now if I saved, it should be over there onto the left. So there's all of these different tags that we can work with, some of them for styling, some of them which specify, like, for example, the text. We're going to look at a lot of these as we go through the tutorial. You could also change the font size. If you want to see all of the attributes that are available, once again, this text editor is really good. So if you just hit space, then this little window should pop up, and these are all the different attributes that we can give this. So for example, here's one that says is visible. If I was to add this in, I could say false. And if I say is visible is false, now you'll see that it disappears. So you can play around with some of these different attributes. We're going to look at a lot of these throughout the tutorial, but if you want, you can just kind of play around and see what's going on. Okay, so that's a little introduction into XAML. This is the environment that we're going to be working with, or that we're going to be working in a lot. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually just remove some of this, and I want to start introducing some core concepts for Xamarin Forms. Specifically, I want to talk about how this XAML file gets connected to our C# files. So you'll see over here on my little file explorer, I have this mainpage.xaml file, and then I also have mainpage.xaml.cs. So .cs, it stands for C#. This is all C# code, and this was just generated by the app when we initially created it. And these two files, so the XAML file and then also the C# file, we can actually connect these, so we can use them together. All of the user interface for the app is going to be here in the XAML file, and all of the logic for the app, like basically anything that we want to have that's coded or have that has logic, is going to be in the C# file. And you'll see, like, as we go through this tutorial, how I'm going to be jumping in between the XAML file and in between some different C# files and how those get combined together. But I just want to show you some really basic things that we can do just to kind of get your brain working and show you how these two things are connected. So one of these attributes that we can create is called a button. And if you want to see all the different one of the tags that we can create is called called a button. And if you want to see all the different tags that you can create, you can just type in that less than sign, and then once again this window should pop up. So there's all of these different tags or elements that we can add here into the XAML. The one that I want though is going to be a button. So a button is just, a user interface button. You can click on it and we can respond to that. This is going to be a self-closing tag, and the button is going to take a text attribute. So in here we could just say, maybe it's called click me, just like that. And you should see that that button will show up over here. Now I want to show you how we can combine the XAML and the C#. So what I want to do is I actually want to run some code whenever this button is clicked. In other words, I want to respond to the user performing the click action here on the button. So there is another property, and once again, you can see all the attributes or properties that we can add onto here, but one of them is called clicked. And clicked is a property that's going to take an event handler. So when we have these different user interface elements, for example, like this button over here, some of these have events that are attached to them. So in the case of the button, one of the events that can be performed with the button is when the user clicks on it, right? We want to be able to respond to the user performing that click event. So you can see over here, if you just say clicked, and then inside of this open and closed quotation marks, we can actually put the name of a function or a class method. So in here, I'm going to put Handleclick. So I'm going to put this name Handleclick in here. I'm going to save this file, and then I'm going to head over to my C# file. Now inside of this C# file, down here, I'm just going to say public void, and I'm actually going to create a method which is going to get called whenever that button gets clicked. And we're going to call this Handleclick. So the name of this method needs to match the name that you put over here. And by default, Xamarin Forms is going to connect these two files automatically, so you don't have to worry about doing that. And you can see up here it says like this class attribute, which is on this content page. This is specifying like which C# file this is connected to. So in this case, it's the main page.cs file, which is this one. So we're going to create this Handleclick method, and it's going to look just like this. And this is going to take two arguments. So the first is going to be an object called sender, and then the second is going to be an event argument, which is just called args. Now, you don't really need to worry about these too much. We will talk a little bit more about some of these arguments, but for now, you just need to know that you need to have these parameters specified in here, because that's sort of the signature that Xamarin Forms is expecting. So down here, why don't we do a console log? So I'll say console.write, and we can do a write line. And then in here, I'm just going to say clicked. So this should hopefully demonstrate how we can wire up the XAML with the C#. So now what I want to do is I want to actually restart the app. So anytime that you change the XAML code, you can just save it and then it'll automatically update. But anytime that you change this CS code, this C# code, you have to restart the app. So I'm just going to hit this stop button and then we'll hit the play button again. This should only take a couple seconds. It's a little bit inconvenient, but it should be fine. And so now this is going to load up, and if we click the button, we should be able to see the output down here in this terminal. So down here in the application output, this is where any of our console.write lines are going to show up, and we'll use this to debug our app as we go through the tutorial. So I'm going to click this button, and you'll see down here that it says clicked. So I can keep clicking the button, it'll keep running this method, and you can see now that these two things are connected. So this is something that's really common to do in these Xamarin Forms apps, which is just have some sort of a user interface element. Maybe it's a button, maybe it's an input field, whatever it is, and we want to wire that up to our C# through an event handler. So this event, which is this clicked event, is going to execute this Handleclick method, which is defined over here in this class. So that's kind of how it's all wired up together. Okay, so buttons are really useful, and this is like probably one of the simplest like user interface things that has an event. But we're going to be building this to-do list app. And so for our to-do list app, we're going to want the user to be able to type into a search box, right? Type into like an input field with the keyboard, and then they'll be able to add their to-dos that way. So I want to now show you how we could add in an input field. Now this is going to be another one of these elements, and actually I'm going to get rid of this click handler as well. So I'm just going to remove all the code that we just wrote, and we are going to create what's called an entry field. So you can just type in entry like that, And the entry field can take a few different attributes. The main one is going to be the text attribute. So if you just say text like this is actually going to be the text that shows up inside the entry. So if I just said hello world and I saved this, now you'll see over here that we have this little entry field. And if I click on it, like the emulator is giving me this keyboard, but I can go ahead and type into that. And that's going to be sort of one of these user interface elements that we'll use for the to-do list. Okay, so that's the text field. Now you can also have another one which is called placeholder. And placeholder is going to show up whenever there's no text inside the text field. So here I could say like enter a to-do or something like that. So if I save this, now you'll see because there's no text inside of this input, it just says enter a to-do. And then if I was to start typing in here, that goes away. So the placeholder is really good because it just gives the user like an indication of what they should be doing. Okay, so I'm actually going to format these, and anytime you're working in this XAML code, it's important to keep everything organized because this can get really disorganized, and the more disorganized it is, like the more likely you are to introduce bugs into your program. So I really like formatting things like this. I think it's really nice. We have all these attributes which are down here, and it's just like a nice way to kind of look at it. Okay, so we have our entry. Now this is also going to have a couple of different events associated to it. So remember with the buttons, we talked about how we have that click event and we can respond to it in the C# code. We can do the same thing with this entry. So there is an event on here, which is called text changed. So you can type in like that. And once again, we're going to add in an event handler. So I can say handle text changed. So this is going to be the name of a method that we're going to put in our C# code. So over here in the C# code, just like with the button, let's create a public void, and we're going to call this handle text change. And I think I said, yeah, that's what it was called. Okay, so then inside of these parentheses, we're going to specify a couple parameters. So once again, the first one's going to be sender, which is going to be an object. And then the second one is going to be those event args again. Now, we are using this entry field with this text changed property. So actually, there is a more specific data type that we can put here. So if you just start typing in event args, you can see there's all of these different types of arguments that we can get from these different elements. So because I have an event that's getting spawned from an entry field, instead of just having general event args here, I can actually have text changed event args. And when we have these text changed event args, it's going to give us access to the text that got changed. So if I say over here console.writeLine, I can say args dot, and you'll see that we have these different options. So we can say args dot new text value. So we're going to actually console log this out. So what's happening is we have our entry field. Anytime the text changes, I'm going to call the handle text changed method, which is defined over here in the to-do list, in the main page class. And we're going to console log the args.newTextValue. So let me show you how this works. Now, once again, we changed our C# code, so I need to restart the app. So I'm going to hit the stop button and then the play button. And over here now, if I type into my text box or into this entry field, you'll see that the new text should show up down there in the console. So I'm going to type in hello world, and you can see that as I type, that new text sort of shows up there. So this entry field is really important, and as we go through this tutorial, we're going to be using this text change property in order to see when the user is typing and be able to sort of respond to that. Now there's another event here that we can also listen for, which is when the user hits the enter key. So this is called the completed event, and we're going to call this one handle enter press. So the completed event, once again, the user hits that enter key, or the user is just like, done typing into the entry field, and then this will get executed. So this handle enter press. So let's go back over here into our C#, and I can actually just copy this whole thing. And this one's going to be called handle enter press. Now we don't have like a specific event for this one, so this is just gonna be event args. And then over here, I can type out enter pressed. So we have this new event handler called handle enter press. Whenever the user hits enter, right, whenever when they're done typing into the entry field, then we'll go ahead and console log out enter pressed. So once again, we changed the C# So let's restart our app, and then we'll see if this works. Now, with these different tags here, like there are a lot of these different attributes. Like I said, some of them are like have functionality associated to them, like completed and text changed. Some of them are just for styling, like placeholder. There's also some other ones like you can add padding and margins and stuff. That's all stuff that you can sort of play with and you know, just kind of do on your own. But in this case, we're just using this completed one. So I'm going to type into this field, and then I'm going to hit enter. And you'll see down here that it said enter pressed, and also like that keyboard went away. So these are the two events that we're interested in with this entry field. We are interested in responding to whenever the text changes, and then responding to whenever the user has sort of completed typing into this text field. Now, what I want to do now is sort of show you how we can take the text that's from this search bar, and then we can actually use it to create different elements here on the app, so here on the page. So this is going to be kind of like a really rudimentary version of our to-do list app. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here, and I'm actually going to create another set of tags. Now this is going to be one of those container tags, which is called a stack layout. Now the stack layout is what we're using up here, and the stack layout basically just allows you to lay out elements one on top of the other, so in a stack. And this is going to be perfect for our to-do list because we want to lay out the elements one after another. So I'm going to go ahead and give this an attribute, which is called a name. And all you have to do to give this attribute a name is you can say x:name. And then over here, I'm going to make an open and close quotation marks, and we're going to like give this a name. And this is going to be like a unique identifier that we can use to refer to this. So I'm going to call this to-do list, because this is going to kind of be like the container for all of our to-dos. Now check this out. If I come over here into my code, I can actually access that. So I'm just going to do this in this handle enter press method, but I could say to-do list, and you'll see that my text editor is saying that this is a stack layout, and maybe I can get that back. So it's a stack layout on the main page of the to-do list. So this to-do list right here, this is actually referring to this stack layout over there. Because I gave it this name attribute, I'm now able to easily refer to it in my C# code. So what I want to do is whenever the user hits the enter key, I want to take whatever text they entered into that text box, and I basically want to create a new little user interface element here on the app that has that text in it. And this is going to be very similar to what we're going to end up doing when we create our like final to-do list. So I just want to kind of show you how this works. So whenever the user presses the enter key, I want to take the text that's inside of the text box, like I said, and I want to then display that below onto the screen. Now, in order to do that, we're gonna actually dynamically create a user interface element. So we're gonna dynamically create one of these labels. Now, remember before that we looked at that label element. So I can call this label, and the label takes a text property. So if I set in here like my name, Mike Dane, then this is gonna show up down here. And it's a little small, so there are some other attributes, like you can say font size. So we can make this like 36, or let's not do 36, maybe like 20. We'll just increase it a little bit. That way we can see it. And there's also some other kind of like default things in here. So we could also say instead of 20, you could say like large, and then that will show up there as well. So it's kind of the same thing, just whatever you kind of want to do. So what I want to do is whenever the user types into the search bar and then hits enter, I want to create one of these labels, and I want to add it down here onto the page. So essentially I want to take a label and I want to put it here inside of this stack layout. So, you know, I could have like 4 or 5 of these, and this would kind of replicate what it would be like to have a to-do list. So they'd all kind of be sort of rendered out there one on top of the other. So I'm going to show you how we can do this dynamically from our C# code, right? If I want to create a label here in my Xaml file, all I have to do is just write it out like this. But if I want to do this in response to the user hitting the enter key, I have to do it in my C# code. So let's go over here, and whenever the user hits the enter key, I want to create one of these labels. So I'm going to say label, and we'll call it, why don't we call this new to do, and I'm going to set it equal to a new label. Now this label here, this refers to that label that we looked at over here in this XAML file. So that's exactly the same as this thing over here. Okay, those are like basically connected. It's the same stuff. So then what I can do is I can say new to do dot text. So here I'm essentially like adding in that text property, but I'm doing it in my C# code. And I want to set the text of this new label equal to the text that's here inside of this entry field. Now the question becomes, and I'm actually going to get rid of this real quick because I want to show you, how do we get the text that's inside of this entry field? When we did the handle text change, we were able to say args.newTextValue. When we're down here though, we're not able to do that. So what I want to do is I want to essentially do the same thing that I did with this stack layout, which is I want to give it a name. So over here on the entry field, I'm going to give it a name, and I'm going to say xName, and let's call this input field. So this is going to be the input field property, right? This now has a name of input field. And if I come down here, I could actually console.writeLine, and now I can refer to this entry field by the name input field. So over here, I'm going to say console.log input field dot text. So if I console log out the input field dot text, it'll essentially tell me whatever text is inside of the input field when I hit that enter key. So let's come back over here, and we changed our C# code, so we're actually going to need to restart the app. That's fine. And then the user is going to type into the entry field, they'll hit enter, and then we'll access that input field's text property and we'll print it out onto the screen. So I'm going to type in over here, hello world, and now I'm going to hit enter, and you'll see here that it says enter pressed, and then it printed out the value that was here inside of this search field, which was hello world. So that's how we're able to get the text. Now what I want to do is I want to set that equal to the new to-dos text. So remember, the new to-do, this is like going to be one of those labels, and we want to set the text of it equal to the input field's text. So now check this out. If I save this and I restart my app because we modified our C# code. So I'll save this. Now let's come over here to the search bar, and I'm going to start typing in. So let's type in hello world. So now when I hit the enter key, the handle enter press method is going to be fired. Okay. We're going to do this console log. We're going to create a new label, and then we're going to set that label's text equal to the text that was in the input field. And actually, I forgot one last step, which is we want to add this label over here into our stack layout. And I'm going to show you how to do that. So we've created this new label. We've set the text field. Now I want to add this in to this stack layout. And I'm going to do all of that in our C#. So down here, once again, we can refer to this by the name to-do list. So let's come back over here, and I'm going to say to-do list, and there's an attribute on here which is called children. So you can say to-do list.children, and .children, that's just going to refer to like anything that's inside of here. So anything that's like inside of this stack layout here. So then we can say children.add, and this is going to allow us to add something onto the children. So here we can add in the new to-do. Okay, so let's restart this one more time, and we'll see how we did. So let's type over here into the text field. I'll type in hello world. I'm going to hit enter, and then this will then get added down here. So you can see now that hello world is added down there onto the document. Now, once again, this is a little small, so we could say like new to do dot font size, and then we could set this equal to like 20. And so now it should be like a little bit bigger. And actually, maybe this just needs to be a number. Okay, yeah. Cool. So this whole process is very common to do in these Xamarin Form applications. And really the whole idea is that we have a way to get information from the user, right? And once we get that information from the user, then we can use that to create additional UI elements, right? So now I can type into here, and as much as I type in, you can see that all these new things get added in, right? So we can type in whatever we want, and then they're just sort of showing up down there. And all that is just through this code right here. Now, the last thing I want to show you how to do is clear out this text. So you can see here, like if I hit enter, then the text still stays up here. So there's one last thing that we can do, and we could say, so what we want to do is we want to access that entry. So we could say input field dot text, and I'm going to set this equal to an empty string. So this input field dot text, what this is going to do is it'll modify the text attribute on the input field, and it'll clear it out. So after we've created the new to-do label, right? After we've created this new thing and we've set the font size and all that, and then we've added it onto the to-do list, which is this thing right here, then we're just going to clear out the text that's in the input. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll just restart the app, and you can see how that works. Okay, so I'm going to type in here, let's do hello world. I'll hit enter, and you'll see then that the text in here disappears, which just has to do with this line of code down here. Cool, so that is a little bit of an introduction into all of this stuff, right? We're just getting comfortable working in the XAML file, we're getting comfortable working in the C# file, and one of the big things that we saw here is that even though we didn't explicitly put a label inside of here, right? Even though I didn't explicitly like place something in here, I'm able to do that in my C# code dynamically. And that's really important. This concept that we can use the C# in order to dynamically add elements or tags here into our XAML file is like super important, okay? So with the XAML, we basically set up like a little scaffold, and then we can use the C# to kind of inject data into there dynamically. It's like super common thing to do in these situations. So just with this, we kind of have a little to-do list, right? You could use this to create something, right? So you could say like, walk the dog, right? So now I'm sort of adding these different things, take out the garbage, whatever. So it kind of works. It's kind of basic. Obviously, we're just adding text into a list, but it should give you an idea of sort of how this is put together. But now that we sort of understand the basics, I want to talk about really how we would build this application as Xamarin Forms developers. So this is a valid way to do this, right? You could build this to-do application using this strategy where we have these like event handlers and they're all tied into this XAML file. But a lot of times when people build applications using Xamarin Forms, they're not going to do it in exactly this way. And it's just because when we do things this way, it doesn't really scale very well. This is a very simple application, right? We only have a couple of different pieces of information that we're keeping track of. There's only like, we just have this input field and then some labels. But as these applications get more complex, a lot of times this method doesn't scale very well. So what we want to do is we want to use what's called a design pattern. And a design pattern is a way of structuring our code, which makes it really scalable and makes it really easy to add functionality and to sort of maintain all of the state that's in our application. And the main design pattern that we use in these Xamarin Forms is called model view view model. And this is a pretty common way of structuring code, specifically with apps that have user interfaces like this. And so what I want to do is I want to walk you through some of like the core concepts of this, and we'll start scaffolding out how we can build our app using model view view model. So over here, I just have this little, diagram of what this is. And I just want to talk real quick about what the model view view model is. So this is composed of 3 different parts. We have a model, we have a view, and then we have a view model. So in our to-do application, we're working with these different to-do list items. And that is what's going to be defined over here in the model. So the model sort of maps out what the actual object or the actual entity is that you're working with in your app. In our case, we have this to-do list app, so we're working with these different to-do items. And a to-do item has, at least in this case, 2 different properties. So it has a text property, which is a string, and then it also has a complete property, which is a Boolean. So this complete property, what this is going to do is it's going to tell us whether or not that to-do's been complete, right? We can sort of check it on or off. So this is the model, and it models the real world entity that we're working with in our app. That's why we call it a model, because it's sort of like it just models that real thing, right? This to-do. And so this is just going to be the definition of what a to-do item is. Then over here, we have the view. And the view is basically the XAML stuff. So the view is everything that the user is seeing. So in our case, we have this little to-do list app, and this is what the view is generally going to look like. So we'll have all the to-dos text sort of displayed out there. We have our search bar, and then we have this little checkbox. Now you can see that there is a mapping between the model and the view, right? So the model's text, the to-do items text, is displayed over here in the view. And then we also display whether or not it's complete. So if you've checked this checkbox, like if it's red, that means it's complete. Otherwise, if it's unchecked, that means that it's incomplete. And then we also have this little trash can, which will help us to delete these. Okay, so that's the model and the view. And these two things are really important. You can see that they're linked together, right? We want to display the data that's in the model on the view. But the last step here is this middle part, which is called the view model. And it's not a coincidence that it's a combination of view and model, right? It's those two words together. The view model is what sort of connects the view and the model together. So that's why it's in the middle here. It sort of connects the model, which is this to-do item, over onto the view. Now in this case, we have a to-do list. So what we're going to be displaying to the user is a list of to-do items. And this view model is going to keep track of all of the different to-do items that are going to show up on the view. And anytime we add a to-do item to this to-do items view model, or we remove one, or we toggle one, it'll update the view. It'll update the user interface. So this view model, we could just call it to-do list view model. And it has an array over here called to-do items. And it just has, a bunch of these different to-do items in it. And it also has some functionality. So we can add a to-do item, we can remove a to-do item, and we can toggle a to-do item. So toggling would be like, change it from complete to incomplete or vice versa. So the view model is what connects the model over to the view, right? So we have this to-do items array, and this is what's going to end up getting displayed over here on the view. And the idea is that anytime this to-do items array updates, so whether we add an item, we remove an item, or we toggle an item, it'll update the view to match that. And we call this binding. So there's this two-way binding that we have between the view model and the view. And it basically means that anytime we update the view model, so anytime we update this to-do items array, it'll update it on the user interface. And then anytime that we update the view, it'll update it over here on the view model, et cetera, right? So there's this binding that takes place between these two entities in our program, and that's what we're going to use in order to make our app really usable, like really scalable, and so it's written kind of the correct way, right? The Xamarin Forms way. So once again, this is called a design pattern. And look, if you're still a little shaky on like what all this is, that's totally fine. We're going to go through this in explicit detail as I code it out. But I just wanted to give you a quick introduction into how the model, view model, we call this MVVM, how that works. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to start implementing this. And the first thing that we'll do is we'll create the model. So like I said, the model just maps out what a to-do item looks like in our program. So what we're going to do is we're going to come over here, and you're just going to right click on the solution code here, and you're going to come down to add, and then you're going to say new class. So we want to add an empty class, and we're going to call this to-do item. So just create that class, and you can see that Visual Studio just basically scaffolded this whole thing out for us. Now, if we look at the model, it needs a text attribute and it needs a complete attribute. So we're going to add those attributes up here. So I'm just going to say public, and first we're going to do the text. So I'm just going to call this to-do text, and then I'm going to create a getter and a setter. So this basically means that the user can access the to-do text and that they can also modify it. That's all that this syntax means over here. It's just called a getter and a setter. And then we're going to create a Boolean, which is going to be this complete. And actually, I have this here as a string. This should be a Boolean. That's my mistake. So this is going to be a Boolean, and we're going to call this complete. And once again, this is going to have a getter and a setter. So this will basically determine whether or not the to-do has been completed or not. Okay, so we have these two attributes. Now I also want to add these into the constructor. So I'm going to say string to-do text and bool complete. Now, if you're not 100% sure what I'm doing right here, this is just like C#, like object-oriented code in C#. So if you're a little bit confused about that, it might be worth going and, maybe watching a couple other videos about how this stuff is structured. And I have videos on all this stuff on my channel if you want to check that out. I kind of go through all of this in detail. But what we're going to do here is we're just going to allow the user to pass in the to-do text and the complete whenever they create one of these to-do items. And then we're going to say like this dot to-do text is equal to to-do text, and this dot complete is equal to complete. Okay, so that should actually do it for our to-do item model. And so now we have an entity, right? We have an object in our code that we're able to use to sort of store and keep track of all of these to-do items. Now, the next thing that we need to do is we want to create this view model. And this is going to be something that we're going to be continually updating throughout the tutorial, but we just want to sort of scaffold this out and create like the most basic version of it. So real quick, let's just take a look here at the different things. So we have this to-do items list, and then we also have 3 functions down here in order to modify that list. So the first thing we'll do is just create this object or create this class with the to-do items. So let's go back up here. You're going to right click on the solution, and then you're going to say add new class, and we're going to call this to-do list view model. Okay. Now remember, we're going to be rendering out a list of to-dos, and so that's why this needs to be to-do list view model as opposed to just like to-do item view model. It's because we want to, like, the view model connects you with the view, and we want to render out all of these different things. And we'll talk a lot more about this as we go. Okay, so we're going to create this, and this can just go right here in the main directory. And this is going to have, like I said, one attribute, which is going to be like a list of these to-do items. Now, this is going to be public, and we're going to call this to-do items. Now, as far as the data type goes, because this is in a view model, this is going to actually, it can't just be a regular list or a regular array. It has to be what's called an observable collection. So if we want to use this thing called observable collection, you want to come up here to the top of your file, and you're going to say using, and this is called system, and let's see if I can get the, no, okay, so it's called system.collections.object model. So this is what we want to add in here. And then you're going to say public, and it's observable collection, just like this. And then in here, we're going to put to-do item. And then we can put this over here, and we're also going to give this a getter and a setter. Okay, so this line of code, what we're doing is we're creating an observable collection, and this basically means that this is a collection that the view can sort of observe and update itself whenever it updates. So this is sort of where that binding comes in. In order for us to be able to render all these to-do items onto the view, it needs to be contained inside of an observable collection. This is just something that's part of this Xamarin Forms stuff. And this little syntax over here where we have this like less than, greater than sign, and then to-do item, this just means that it's going to be an observable collection that has to-do items inside of it. So once again, the to-do item, that's this model that we just created, and the to-do item is going to be a collection, an observable collection of those to-do items. Cool. So that's kind of how that works. Now there's one last thing that we want to do, which is down here in the constructor. So we want to initialize this thing. So down here, we're going to say to-do items is going to be equal to a new observable collection of to-do items, just like that. So here we're defining that this to-do list view model has a to-do items attribute on it, and then we're initializing that to be an empty collection. Now, the last thing that we can do is let's add some to-do items into this just to kind of make sure that it works. So we can say down here to-do items. So that's once again this observable collection. And then we can say .add. And in here, I'm going to add in a new to-do item. So I'm going to create a new to-do item just like that. And then in here, we need to pass in the text. So why don't we call this to-do 1? And then over here, we're also going to pass in whether this is complete or not. So why don't we say that that's false? So let's do this a couple times, and maybe we'll make 3 of these. So whoops, that's going to be 2, and then this one's going to be 3. So all we're doing here is we're creating this to-do list view model. Now, once again, this is what's going to kind of inform what's going to go on our view. So it's all of the to-dos that are inside of this to-do items collection, which are going to get rendered out as part of the user interface over here. And I'm going to walk you through how we can sort of bind those two things together. But this is the way that we can set it up. And then down here inside the constructor, we're just initializing it to be an empty observable collection, and then we're adding in 3 to-do items. And so now in our program, anytime we create one of these to-do list view models, it'll be initialized with 3 items inside of it. Cool. So we've created 2 parts of this. We created the model and we created the view model. The last thing we want to do is we want to go and create the view. So what I want to do is I want to make it so that I can display all of the to-do items that we have stored in our view model on the view itself. So let's go back over to our XAML file. So this is mainpage.xaml. Now, in order for us to render out a list, we actually can't use this stack layout. So this stack layout isn't going to work for us if we're trying to render out a list. Instead, what we want to do is we want to render out what's called a list view. So I'm going to change this to, instead of stack layout, I'm going to change it to list view, and we can keep the name on there. But what this is going to do then is it's going to allow us to display, like I said, all of those to-dos. And what we want to do is we want to take this and we want to bind it to that view model. So if you remember over here, we have this binding that's taking place. And this can be like a one-way binding or a two-way binding. But we want to bind these two things together so that any time that this to-do list view model updates, so anytime these to-do items update, I want the user interface to update over here. Okay. Now there's a couple things that we need to do to set this up, and there's a little bit of code that we're just going to need to put in here real quick. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do in order to bind these two things together is we need to add an entry up here on this content page tag. So this content page tag has these things called XMLNS. It stands for XML namespaces. Basically, this is a way that we can tell our XAML file here about some of the other code that's in our program. So you can see here we have this like X class thing. This basically is what connects this XAML file to the main page.xaml.cs file. We want to add in another one here, and I'm just going to paste this in because I have it on my clipboard. But this is something that you can go ahead and copy, and actually this should be to-do list app. So you're going to type in xmlns : and then you're going to say local right here, and then you're going to say equals, and then inside of quotation marks CLR namespace. Basically means like clear namespace, and then this colon, and then the to-do list app. And what this will do is this will allow us to be able to access this view model here inside of our code. So this is what's going to help us to connect this XAML file with this to-do list view model over there. And then the last thing that I want to do, and I actually also have this that I'm just going to paste in. So I want to paste this code. Now you guys can just copy this down. So it's going to be this tag content page.binding context. So you're going to have that as a tag, and then in here you're going to put local and then to-do list view model. So this over here is what completes the binding. So we've told our XAML file that we want to be able to access the code that's here inside of this to-do list app, which is like all of these files over here. And now what we're saying is this XAML file is going to have a binding context. Now the binding context, it's just like what this thing is bound to. And this thing is now bound to our to-do list view model. And so that means that we can actually interact with and like access some of the values that are inside of our to-do list view model here in our XAML file. So you need this little local thing up here, and then you also need this binding context declaration down there. So once you've done that, now these two things are bound together. So the view list model is bound together with the XAML file here. Okay, so then here in our list view, what I want to do is I want to tell this list view to render out all of the items that are here inside of this to-do items list. That's what I want to do here. And we can do that using a property. So you're going to say here items source, just like that. And then inside of this item source, we're going to put an open and closed curly bracket. Now this is a very special syntax. We use this open and closed curly bracket when we want to put like a little bit of logic in here. So normally you would just put like a string in here, right? But when we put these open and closed curly brackets, we can put some other like special syntax in here. So what I want to do is I'm going to say binding, and you're going to say to-do items. So what this means is that this list view is going to be bound to all of the to-do items that are here inside of this list view. And it's because we specified the binding context up here that we can just access to-do items. Okay, so that's how we know what these to-do items are. So the source of data for this list view is going to be these to-do items. Now, if you remember before, we were able to sort of like dynamically put elements in here in our C# when we hit the enter key. It's the same exact process. It's just that now it's automated. So now C# is going to do this, or like Xamarin Forms is going to do this for us like in the background. So we don't really need to worry about it. So check this out. I'm going to save this file. And we did change a bunch of our C#, so let me restart this. Now, theoretically, what should happen is we should be able to render out all three of those to-do items there onto the app. Okay, so it looks like we have some errors here. And I think this has to do with the fact that we forgot to remove this code. So I still have these handle text change and this handle enter press stuff in here, so we can just get rid of that. And that was just in main page.xaml.cs. So yeah, we just need to clean up after ourselves. And there actually might be some leftover code as well in here. Okay, yeah, so I still have, for this entry, I still have this completed and this text change thing, so we also need to get rid of those. Okay, so that should hopefully fix all the errors. And yeah, it looks like it's deploying. Okay, cool. So we cleaned up our code a little bit there, that's good. And so like I said, now what should happen is we should see all three of those to-do list items rendered out here. So you can see that we do indeed have all three of those. Now, you'll notice that it says over here, it just says like to-do list app.to-do item. And this is because we're not explicitly telling XAML what we want these to look like. In other words, we're not like, this is just empty in here, right? There's nothing in here. And so when XAML dynamically inserts those to-do items into this list view, it doesn't really know like what they should look like. So all it's doing is it's just basically telling us that they're to-do items, but it's not displaying like the text or anything like that. So that's the next thing that we want to do. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to, inside of here, now there's going to be some complex XAML syntax here. So you just need to stick with me, but we're going to create a list view dot, and this is going to be called list view dot item template. So list view dot item template, this is another one of these little containers. I'm going to try to keep this as organized as possible. So we need an item template, and this is going to allow us to specify how we want these to-do items to display themselves over there on the app. And then inside of here, we're going to say data template. And this data template thing, this means that we're going to be able to access the data that's inside of these to-do items. So we have our data template, and then in here, we're going to have a view cell, just like that. Now, I know this is a lot of, like, there's a lot of syntax here. This is one of the criticisms that Xamarin Forms is often getting, is that there is a lot of complex syntax, but once we get this sort of set up, it'll be nice and easy for us to manage. So we have our list view, and you can see I'm just keeping this really well organized. It's very important that you do that as well. So we have our list view, and then we have an item template, data template, and then finally the view cell. Now in here, we can create a label. So I'm going to create a label, and I'm going to give this a text attribute. Now what we want to happen is we want to display the to-do text from each one of these to-do items up here. So remember, the list view is connected to these to-do items that are here inside of the view model. And what we want to do is we want to display the to-do text for each one. So once again, I'm going to use these open and close curly brackets. This is a special syntax. And I'm going to say binding, and I'm going to say to-do text, just like that. Now what this means is that I want to bind the text of this label to the to-do text of each one of these to-do items. And that's where this data template thing comes in. So because this is inside of the data template, we're able to access the pieces of data that are inside of each one of these to-do items. So in the to-do model, like this is called to-do text. It's the text of the to-do. And so that's what we want to display down here. So let me save this, and let's see if it updates. We might need to restart. Okay, so it's looking good. And actually, let me change the font size. So let's make this 25, something like that. So we can see them nice. All right, why don't we just make this large? Keep it consistent. So now you can see that we're displaying out the to-do text for each one of those to-dos that we created. Now remember, over here in the to-do list view model, whenever we create one of these to-do list view models, it automatically populates it with 3 to-dos. So that's where this data is coming from. And that whole process of like initializing this and like creating it, it's all happening like basically up here when we bind the to-do items as the item source. Okay, so C# is going to do that in the background. Xamarin Forms is going to handle all that for us. All we have to do then is just something like this. Cool. So this right here is a super, super, super common process, and it's one of the core processes involved in this model view model data structure or design pattern, right? So this whole thing where we have the view model, and then the view model is able to sort of be bound to the view, and obviously we're using the model here with this to-do text and all that. Super common. So this is kind of like the core, I guess, like topics for all of this stuff. Cool. So we're able to display all of the to-dos, and that's good, but there's a lot more that we need to do, right? Because remember before we were able to type into this text box and then I hit enter and then the new to-do showed up. I want to be able to wire that in. Now it's going to be a little bit more complex to do this using the model view model design pattern, but it'll end up being worth it because the way that we do this is like really efficient, and this is like kind of like the way that we're supposed to do it with this design pattern. So I'm going to walk you through how to do that. So how do we wire up this search bar with our to-do view model so that we can hit the enter key and then everything just sort of happens? Okay, so let's go back over to our to-do list view model, and I want to start walking you through how we're going to do this. If you look back over on this, now let me present this again. The view model has a few of these different functions, right? So there's some functionality. So we can add to-dos, we can remove them, and we can toggle them. So the first functionality that we want to sort of encode into this is the add functionality. So I want to be able to add a to-do to the list. Now that function is going to be over here in the to-do list view model, okay? Now, there is a process that we need to use in order to do this. I'm going to walk you through it, so don't worry if it's like a little confusing as we go. I'll sort of bring everything together at the end. But the first thing that we need to do is we want to create a attribute or a property on this class which can store whatever text is inside of this text field. Remember we had this like text changed thing, and the text changed, like we had a handle text changed method, and we were able to use that in order to like listen for when the text changed. We basically want to do the same thing, except we want to store whatever text is here inside of this entry field. We want to store that inside of an attribute that's here on the to-do list view model. Remember, the to-do list view model, this is what's connecting our view to our model. This is what's informing what's going to show up on the view. So if something's happening on the view, I can actually store it here on this view model. So I'm going to create, and once again, like we'll talk about this as we go, but I'm going to create a string here, and we're going to call it new to-do input value. So this is going to store whatever value is up here in this entry field. These two things are going to be like bound together. We'll end up binding those together. So new to-do input value. And we just want to give this a getter and a setter. Cool. So now we can access this, we can modify it, etc. And what I want to do then is I want to bind this to this entry field. So I'm going to save this. Now let's go back over to our XAML file. And inside of this XAML file, I'm going to say that the text of this entry field, so remember this right here, this is this entry field that's over here. And we're going to use a similar syntax that we used down here. So I'm going to say open and close curly bracket, binding, and we're going to put new to-do input value. So now the value, basically like the text value that's inside of here, is going to be bound up to this new to-do input value, which is a field that we've created here on this to-do list view model. Now you could put this up here, like a lot of times programmers will do this where like we have all the the fields or the attributes of our class up together, but you'll see in a second like it's better if we put it down here, because then we can, like, this will all kind of be like organized together. Okay, so let's save that. And now these two things are bound together. And once again, because we're using this binding, like C# is going to handle all of this for us. So we don't need to do this text change thing anymore. We can just have it bound here, and then those two things will, like, it'll basically update whenever we change it. Okay, so there's that binding that's there. Cool, so that's the first thing that we need to do. But if you remember, like when we did this before, we also want to be able to listen for that enter key, right? So we want to be able to listen for when the user hits the enter key, and then we want to be able to basically use that to create a new to-do. Before, when we did this, we had event handlers. So I said completed, right? And then we would create an event handler here. In this case, when we're using model view view model and we're using these bindings, we don't want to use an event handler, okay? Instead, we want to use what's called a command. And a command is similar to an event handler, except that it's sort of bound up in all of this binding stuff. So the command is, yeah, it's kind of like a method or a function, kind of like an event handler, but it'll allow all of this to work together. So let me show you how this works over here. Now, in order for us to create a command, we're going to need to import something. Now, let me first write out the syntax. So we're going to put this right above here, right above this new to-do input value. And I'm just going to say public, and we're going to create something called iCommand. Now, it won't be in here by default. I'm pretty sure it's from system.windows.input. Yeah, so if you do, we'll say using system.windows.input, we're going to say public iCommand. So now that should be available to us. And this is going to be called add to do command. So this add to do command, like I said before, it's very similar to an event handler. It's just that it's going to work with all this binding stuff. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use this special syntax. So this is like what we call an arrow syntax. And all this is going to do is it's just going to say new command. And you'll see that once again, we don't have this available to us. So you can say using up here, Xamarin.Forms, and this will give us access, Xamarin. Make sure you spell it right. This will give us access to this command. And then in here, we're going to make an open and close parentheses. Now, the last thing that we need to do down here is we need to create a method. So I'm going to say void add to do item. And this method is basically going to get called whenever the user like hits that enter key, okay? And we need to kind of pipe this through to this command thing. So in here, you're going to say add to do item. Now, the way this works, once again, is this command is going to get executed whenever the user hits the enter key. And the command is basically saying that whenever this command is run, we just run the add to do item. This is a little like, it's a little kind of, you kind of have to go through multiple steps to get this to work. It's just how we do it in Xamarin Forms. So this pattern is like very common to use, so that you just kind of need to get used to this syntax, okay? But if you don't fully understand everything that's going on here, it's okay. Like we're gonna wire it up and get it to work anyway. So this add to do item, now let me actually just console.writeLine in here, and then we're gonna wire this up to our view. So we can say enter pressed. Now we have this add to do command. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna come over here into my main page.xaml file, and on this entry, I'm going to say return command. So return just refers to like hitting the enter key, right? And this is essentially saying, what command do you want to run whenever the user hits the enter key? And in this case, we called it the add, and actually we need to make this open and close curly bracket. I'm going to say binding the add to do command. Okay, so we're binding this add to do command, which was this command that we created up here. Basically, all you need to know is that whenever this command is run, we just run this add to do item method. We have to kind of set it up this way. And then that's bound to the return. So let's see if this works. Now we modified our C# code, so let's restart the app. And theoretically what should happen then is I hit the enter key, all of this binding stuff hopefully works, and then it'll say enter pressed. So let's see when this loads up here. So I'm going to type in, and then I'm going to hit the enter key, and you'll see down here it says enter pressed. So all of that is like bound together. Now obviously there's a lot of steps here. This is some funky syntax over here, but it's just how we do it in Xamarin Forms. Cool. So what I want to do then is I want to actually create a new to-do. So the user types in the text, right? And I want to create a new to-do. And I actually forgot to say one thing. So remember this new to-do input value. This is bound to the text that's in the entry field, like we talked about that. So actually you could say, if we said console.writeLine, and then in here, if I printed out new to-do input value, this is actually going to be the input that's in that entry field. So we got to restart this because we are working in C#. And so now when I type in, I will actually have access to the new to-do input value, which is why we had to set this up over here. Okay, so I hit enter and you can see there's all the text that I just typed in. So once again, just to kind of talk about this binding one more time, this new to-do input value is bound up to the text of the entry field. Whenever we hit enter, whenever the return command is run, right? We're going to run this add to do command, and this add to do command just calls this add to do item method. So it is like a roundabout way of doing it, but that's what's going to allow all of this to kind of get wired together. Cool. All right, so now what we want to do is we want to use all of this to create a new to-do. In other words, we want to add a new to-do into this to-do items array. So I'm going to say to-do items, and we'll say .add, and then over here, it'll just be basically this same syntax. So we'll say new to-do item, and then in here, so the first argument is going to be the text. So this is just going to be the new to-do input value, and then the second thing here is going to be whether it's complete or not. We'll just make it false. So with that line of code, I think this should be wired up, and we have the add ready to go. This is going to be awesome. So we'll type in, we'll hit enter, and then an item will get added to this to-do items list. Now, because all of this is bound together, when we add a new item to the to-do items list, it should automatically show up over here on the screen. So it'll basically get dynamically added to that XAML, just like we saw before. So I'm going to type in hello world, I'll hit enter, and you can see that it shows up right there. So that's awesome. All of this is bound together and it looks like it's working. So, I could type in as many of these as I want. I can type my name, whatever, and then they're all kind of showing up there. Perfect. Okay, so we now know how to add to-dos, and we've talked about how all this stuff gets bound together. And once again, this binding is such a good way to do it because as you saw with these to-do items, all I have to do is add an item to the to-do list and it automatically gets updated there on the app. So it just takes away so much of the manual work, so much of the manual labor. If you remember before, when we initially did this, I had to dynamically create a label, it was new to do, whatever, and then I had to append it onto the document. We don't need to do any of that because now it's all bound together. Okay. So that is the add. I'm pretty happy with that. Now the next thing we need to do is remove and toggle. And this remove and toggle, this is going to be really cool because it'll be an opportunity for me to introduce some even cooler concepts in Xamarin Forms. And the first thing that I want to do is show you how we can work with images. So you see over here, we have this little trash can, right? This little trash can guy. And this is like an icon or an image or whatever. So we're actually going to use an image here in our app. And I'll show you how you can add that in. And then you can click on the little trash can and it'll delete all that stuff. Okay, so I have an image of a trash can here. Now let me pull this up. So it's this delete.png guy. Now I'll have a link for you to download this in the description, or if you want, you can just find any PNG, or any, it could be a JPEG too, but just any image that you want to use, like an icon. And but you can use the same one. And so what we're going to do is we're going to add this into our app. So the way that we need to do this is we need to add this, we call it a resource, right? We need to add this into our Android library and also our iOS library. So this is kind of the first time we're talking about iOS and Android. Obviously Xamarin Forms can run on iOS and Android. It runs on both of them. But anytime we're working with these images, we need to add them to this Android folder and this iOS folder. So here in the Android folder, if you go down to resources, and then there's this folder called drawable, we're going to want to take this and we'll just drag it into the drawable folder. And you can just copy it so that way it stays here in our file system. So now in our drawable folder, we have delete.png added in there. So any of the assets or like images, whatever that you want to use, you can just put them in drawable. And then for iOS, we're going to do something similar. So iOS has this resources folder. And once again, we're just going to drag this and we'll drop it in the resources folder. Cool, so we have our delete.png. This is in both of those different folders. Okay, so it's in the iOS and it's also in the Android there. Now what we can do is we can add this into our view. So we're gonna go over to our XAML file, and I wanna put this little trash can just here in my app. Now we want a trash can for each item, right? There's this little trash can here. So we can just put it next to the label, and then I'll also show you how we can format this out. So what we want to do first, though, is I want to create something called a flex layout. And a flex layout, this actually refers to a layout system, which is called Flexbox. And if you have any experience with like HTML or CSS, then you might be familiar with Flexbox. It's not super complicated, and I'll show you exactly what you need for it. But we want to put the label and the little trash can inside of this flex layout because it's just a really easy way for us to lay things out. It's my preferred way of laying things out anytime I'm designing UIs. So for the image, now I can save this and you'll see here it doesn't really change much, right? It looks very similar. But for the image, we're going to create something called an image button. And the image button it's exactly that. It's a button which has an image, and then you can click on it and then we can respond to that. So we saw before like how we can respond to button clicks and stuff. So this image button is going to take a couple of attributes, and the first one here is going to be source. So source, and this can just be an open and closed quotation marks, and then you're just going to put the name of the file. So in my case, it was delete.png. And I'm going to save this. Now, if we restart, so because we added in a resource, like a new image, we have to restart our app because that needs to get loaded in. So we'll restart, and then we hopefully should see this little delete icon there on the app. Okay, so you can see here that we have this little trash can showing up. That's looking good. Now it's a little big, so you can actually scale it. So you could say like scale, if you said, for example, 0.5, that'll scale it down so it's a little bit smaller. It'll basically be like half the size, whatever. So you can make that as big or as small as you want. And then the next thing I'm gonna do as well is I want to give this flex layout a property. So you can see how these two things are like next to each other. We can use this flex layout to separate them out. So you can see here, like we have the text on the left side and then the trash cans on the right side. So you can say here on this flex layout, you could say justify content, and we're going to say space between. And what this will do is it'll just put space in between each one of these elements. And another thing you'll see is that they're not really lined up on that horizontal axis. So you can also say align items center, and now it'll make them so they're kind of on the same field. It's not super easy to see that here, but it does affect it. Okay, another thing that we might want to do is add some padding onto this. So you can see here that they're like right up against the side. So we could say padding, and you can put two values in here. So the first value is going to be the padding that's on the sides. So if I put like 20 here, and then the second one's going to be like the vertical padding. So now you can see that they're kind of like nicely indented in a little bit. Just makes it a little bit easier to see and a little bit easier to use. Now you can play around with these styling more, the stylings more, and there's tons of documentation about this. I don't want to spend too much time talking about the specifics of it just because we're kind of building something general. But yeah, just remember that like, you know, this thing looks decent, but you can make these apps look, you know, insanely professional without too much effort. Also, another thing as well, if you know CSS, you can style all this stuff with CSS, which is cool. Not every CSS attribute is going to work, but like you can straight up write a CSS file if you're used to doing that. Okay, cool. So we have our image button. Now this is looking good and it's nice and formatted, so I can click this. But what we want to happen is I want whenever I click on this little trash can, I want the to-do item to just straight up get removed. So I want that to be completely removed from our little view model here, right? So how do we wire this up? It's going to be actually kind of similar to what we did over here. So we're going to need another method and we're going to need another command, right? So over here we have this remove method. So we want to do something similar to what we did over here. So I'm actually just going to like straight up copy this. No need to rewrite all this code. You can get rid of the new to do input value thing, and we're going to call this remove to do item. And then we're going to call this command remove to do command. And then over here, you want to say remove to do item. So I've just changed all of these. So this is remove, and then this guy over here as well. Now let's just console.log out removing, console.log, console.writeLine. I'm like writing JavaScript here. Okay, so console.writeLine will write out removing. And then over here in the XAML file, I want to wire up this command to whenever the button gets clicked. So that's similar. Remember on the entry, like whenever the return key got hit, we bound it to this add to do command. We're going to do the same thing with this button. So the button has a command, and this command thing, so like before we had like, what is it, clicked? Once again, clicked is going to be for an event handler. We're not working with event handlers. We're working with commands because that's what we do when we bind stuff. So this command property over here, there's going to be a little bit of funky syntax here. I'm going to write it out and then I'm going to explain it to you. Okay, so don't worry if you're like not understanding it. So I'm going to say binding, and we're going to say path is equal to binding context dot remove to do command. And then over here, you're going to put a comma and you're going to say source is equal to, and then an open and closed curly bracket. And then you're going to say, and I just have my notes here. That's what I'm looking at. You're going to say reference and then to-do list. So this thing's a beast right here. I mean, look at this. And I even spelled command wrong. So I'm going to walk you through what's happening here. But first, I just want to make sure that this is wired up correctly. But I will come back and explain all of this. Now, the second thing that we want to put in here is going to be what's called a command parameter. So this is going to be another attribute that's here on this image button. Command parameter is going to be equal to quotation marks. And then over here, you're just going to say binding and then a dot. Perfect. Okay, so just like that. Now, let's go back over to our to-do list view model. Now, once again, I will explain all of that, but I want to add in one item here as a parameter into the remove to-do item. So here you're going to say object O, okay? And I'm going to write some more code here. Once again, well, actually, no, let's just do this first, and then I'll explain that. So let's just see if this is wired up. We modified our C# code, so let me run this just to make sure that we typed everything in correctly. And so what should happen now is when I click on this image button, it should print out removing. So I'll click on this, and you can see down there that it says removing. Okay, so this is all wired up. Now what I want to do is explain what's happening. And so before we do that, though, let me do this. So I'm going to write out this syntax. I'm going to say to-do item being removed. And I'm just here in my to-do list view model. And I'm going to say is equal to O as, whoops, that's a 0, O as view, or no, sorry, as to-do item. Okay, yeah, a lot of notes here. There's a lot of syntax, but hopefully you guys can follow along with what I'm doing. And then over here, I want to type in to-do item being removed dot to-do text. Okay, so once again, real quick, I know there's a lot of code here. Just type along with me, and then I'm going to go through and explain all of this. So we will look at exactly what's going on. That's the one thing, my one criticism of this Xamarin Forms stuff is that there is a lot of this like boilerplate code that we need to write, which I'm not a huge fan of, but the binding stuff is like really powerful. Okay, so I'm going to hit this delete thing, and you'll see down here that it prints out to do 3. If I hit the delete for to do 1, you'll see that it prints out there to do 1. So something is happening here where whenever I click that trash can, I'm able to get access to the to-do item being removed. And now I'm going to walk you through exactly what's happening. So we talked about these commands before, right, when we did this adding stuff. So the command is just something that's run. It's kind of like an event handler whenever something happens on these items that we have bound to our view model. So whenever this command gets run, we call the remove to-do item method. Now over here in the XAML, like we have this command here, and this command just specifies what's the command that's going to be run whenever we click on this delete. And so this is something we've seen before, right? We say binding, but now you'll notice that I'm saying path is equal to binding context.remove to do command. One of the things that we need to realize is that down here where this image button is getting rendered, we're actually inside of this list view. So when I'm inside of this list view and I refer to, and I use this binding thing, and this kind of goes back to something called context, but when I'm inside of this list view, I can't just refer to remove to do command. Because right now, I can only refer to the attributes that are on the to-do item. So for example, I can say to-do text, right? I can just say binding to-do text. And that's because when we're inside of this list view, we're sort of looping over all of these different to-do items. And so the to-do text is part of this to-do item, right? It's part of it. And so that's why we're able to just say binding to-do text. But I couldn't, for example, just say binding remove to-do command because there isn't a remove to-do command on the to-do item model, which is basically what we would be referring to here. So instead, I need to say, okay, the path, basically where you can find this action is going to be binding context.remove to do command. So binding context, this actually just refers to this thing up here. So binding context refers to the to-do list view model. So I'm saying, okay, I want the binding context, which is the to-do list view model, and I want the remove to do command method that's inside of there, which is, or the remove to do command, which is inside of there, which is this guy right here. I know this is confusing. Once again, one of my criticisms of the Xamarin Forms thing is this thing. It's just like not intuitive at all for beginners, but this is just kind of how it works. So yeah, once again, like we can't just say binding remove to do command because when we're down here, we're essentially referring to the attributes that are on the to-do list, or sorry, the to-do item, like the to-do text. So we need to use this path. And like I've been saying, if you're not fully 100% getting this, it's okay. Just know that this is kind of the syntax that we need. Okay, and then over here, this source thing, this is basically just telling us that the remove to do command should be run like on the to-do list. That's kind of what this is saying. Okay, we just kind of need this in here. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. If not, this is one of those things that it is kind of confusing. So it might be worth just kind of like playing around with this or just trying to do it a couple times. But then down here, you see we have this command parameter thing. So this is something that we haven't talked about yet. And you'll notice over here in this remove to do item, this is taking a parameter which is called object O. And whenever we want to delete one of these to-dos, we need to be able to tell which to-do we actually want to delete. And so remember over here, if I click like to-do 2, like to-do 2 shows up down here, I need to be able to tell like which to-do is the user trying to delete, because in the XAML over here, this list view is being used to render out all of those to-do items. And so when I click on one, I need to be able to tell like, hey, which one of these to-dos are we actually trying to delete? And that's where this command parameter comes in. So when you say binding and then you use this dot, it basically means that the to-do item that is that's getting deleted, so the to-do item whose trash can we click, that's going to get passed in over here as object O, okay? And then, so yeah, that's basically how it's wired up, okay? So command parameter binding and then this dot, that means that we're going to pass in the entire to-do item as the argument over here. Now we need to put this as object. Like if I put this as to-do item, I'm pretty sure we'll get an error. So if I put this as to-do item, you'll see that we're getting an error over here. This is just another one of those things that we have to do. So we have the object O, and then down here, what I'm doing is I'm essentially saying that object O right here, that's going to be sort of converted into a to-do item, and then over here we're able to use it as a to-do item, okay? So that's what that command parameter is doing. It's basically passing in to this remove to-do item method whatever the to-do item was that got that we want to delete. And then I'm sort of like, I don't know, what do we call this? Like casting, or I'm doing type coercion. I don't know exactly what you would call this, but I'm essentially taking that generic object that, you know, we're specifying up here, and I'm converting it into a to-do item. Once again, I know this is kind of confusing. Unfortunately, this is just like how it's set up. So, but once you get the hang of this, like it does start to kind of click. So you can just kind of practice this a couple times, and I think it will sort of start to make sense, like how this is all bound together. Okay, so I'm able to do all of that, and we just kind of went through all that removing stuff, right? Now what I want to do is, now that we have the to-do item being removed, I just want to remove that from the list. So here I'm just going to say to-do items dot remove, and then over here you can just say to-do item being removed. Cool. So this will just allow us to remove that to-do item from the list. And just like up here when we added one, when we remove one, it should automatically update on the user interface. So let's go ahead and restart this code, and we will see what happens. Now if I click on one of these to-do items, like over here, you'll see that it disappears from the list. So now I'm able to delete, sort of remove all of those things. Cool. All right, so we've done the adding, we've also done the removing, and we've talked about some of this crazy funky binding syntax and all that stuff. The next thing that we want to do, though, is we want to add in the toggle. And the toggle is going to be interesting because it's also going to allow me to introduce another concept, which is using external packages, okay? So for our toggle, right, we basically have this little, it's like a checkbox, whatever, you click on it and that means that it's complete, or if it's unchecked, it means that it's incomplete, etc., right? So we can do all of that stuff. Now, the first thing I need to do is get access to a toggle element. So believe it or not, there is a checkbox. So I think it's just called checkbox. But the problem with this checkbox is we're not going to be able to use it to like respond to events like this. So, or maybe, I don't know, maybe we can. When I was preparing this, I wasn't able to use the checkbox, and there was like some reason why we weren't able to. But either way, I want to show you how we can use some of these like elements that we could get from like an external package. So we're actually not going to use the built-in checkbox. Instead, we're going to use a checkbox that we get from like an external library. So basically a checkbox that's not included inside of Xamarin Forms by default. And this is like another concept that's really useful. So you're basically like getting external libraries from like some other source. So what you want to do is you're going to go over to your little solution here, and you're going to right click, and then you're going to go to manage NuGet packages. So NuGet, this is what we call a package manager. There's a lot of these different package managers. If you've done JavaScript, like you'll know about NPM, or like there's one called pip, which is for Python. There's one called gems, which is for Ruby. This is the sort of the one for Xamarin Forms. Now what you want to do is you want to come up to the search bar here, and you're just going to type in input kit, just like that. And then this should pop up here, xamarin.forms.input-kit. So you're going to click on that, and then you're going to click add package. So we want to use a checkbox that comes from this. So this input kit, it's essentially like a library, or it's a collection of code. It's basically a collection of these different XAML elements that we can use. And this has a checkbox in it, which I want to use in order to just sort of have the checkbox for our app here. Now, once you've sort of downloaded that package, what we need to do is we need to import it here into our XAML. So there's going to be some other kind of funky syntax, and I'm actually just going to copy this, and then you guys can type it in. So these things are kind of annoying to put in here, but this is like another namespace. So you're going to say xmlns :inputs is equal to, we're going to do this clear namespace thing, a colon, and then plugin.inputkit.shared.controls, and then over here it's going to be like assembly. And actually, you know what, I can just put this in the description of the video, that way you can just copy it just like I did. So yeah, you can just look in the description for that. But this is essentially going to allow us to like import all that stuff from that input kit that we just downloaded into our application. So down here, I'm going to put the checkbox right where it was before. You're going to say input : checkbox. And this means that we're going to use the checkbox that we got from that forms input, or the thing that we just downloaded. So this checkbox is going to be a self-closing tag, and I want to show you here. We can say, and this should have a attribute. So there should be an attribute here which is called isChecked, and we can set this equal to true. So let's see if this works. And I'm just going to render this out over here onto the screen. And actually, whoops, this needs to be a capital B. That's why it's not working. Okay, so checkbox with a capital B, and I think we're going to need to restart this because we just downloaded that NuGet package. So let's restart. Perfect. Okay, so now you can see that we have this checkbox, and it's getting rendered out for each one of these. Now, if you click on it, it'll actually, it'll change, whatever, but you can specify whether it's checked by default using this isChecked property. So what I want to do is I want to make it so that this isChecked property is bound up with whether or not the to-do is complete. So we have this complete field on the to-do, and I want to basically bind it to that. So I can say binding, and then I can just say complete, and this will now bind the value of this checkbox with whether or not this is complete. So just to prove that to you, let's go back to our to-do list view model, and we're creating these, we're sort of adding these default to-dos in, right? I'm gonna make this first one true, and we're gonna need to restart the app. But let me show you, because it's bound up, now the first checkbox should be tied into this value, and it'll actually be checked for us. So we should have one checked one, and then two ones that are completely blank. So you can see, boom, that's exactly what happens. Okay, so now that we have all this wired up, believe it or not, it's pretty much done. So this is kind of all the logic that we needed over here in order to get this to work. And so, I can put this value as true over here, and then it'll sort of inform the user interface as to what it should do. But then if I was to click this and check it, because these two things are bound together, right? Because we have this binding for complete here, if I click this over here, it'll also update the complete property on that to-do. So it's like this two-way binding, which is super powerful. And that's one of the really cool things about using this. So really, at the end of the day, that's kind of all the logic that we need for this to-do list. Obviously, we could add more stuff in here, right? We can make it more complex, whatever. But hopefully that gives you an idea of how you can use this model view model design pattern and sort of building out some of these views. Now, before we kind of wrap up here, there are, I guess, a couple more things that I could show you. One thing in particular is I want to format this a little better. So if we go back over to this document, you can see here that the label and this little checkbox over here on the left are kind of put there together. And this is something that we can do really quick just with the user interface. Obviously, you can play around with the UI more. But if we wanted to do that, we can create another tag over here. And this is just here in my YAML. So we can create a content view. And I'm just going to put this right above the input and the label. And then inside of this content view, I'm going to put a flex layout. And then inside that flex layout, I'm going to put this input, and I'm also going to put, the input, which is the checkbox, and then also that label. Now I know, once again, this is kind of this view is getting very complex. But if you do this, so if we have this content view, and that's just kind of a general container, and then this flex layout, and you'll see here that if I save that now these are both kind of over there on the side. And this also, for some reason, it messes with the size of this image. So if you want, you can just get rid of that scale. I'm not 100% sure why that's happening. But then over here on the flex layout, there's another thing that we can do as well. So we can say align items center, and that's going to kind of align all of these things right there to the center, so that looks kind of good. Okay, so like I said, there's some other stuff that we could do here as well. There's some other logic that we could add in, but I think just for a beginner tutorial, this is probably a good place to stop. We've talked about a lot of stuff, and so now you can kind of go off and play with this and practice it and build some of your own stuff as well. But hopefully that was a good explanation for all of you looking to get into Xamarin Forms development.